Welcome to the Deep Dive. We take stacks of information, cut through the noise, and hopefully give you those aha moments. Today, we're looking at something many of us think we have a handle on, neurodevelopmental disorders. But common knowledge, it can get outdated fast. So our mission is to sort of refresh that foundational understanding. We're drawing on some really rich insights from the Noah's Ark for neurodivergent people community. Okay, let's unpack this. Yeah, the goal is clear, actionable understanding. We've got material from experts, sure, but also crucial stuff from people with lived experience. So you get the academic side and the real-world relatable perspective. Let's dive in. Right, first big thing, the words we use are changing. We're moving away from older terms like just developmental disorders. Wow. Now you hear neurodevelopmental disorders or the neurodevelopmental disorders group. And this isn't just semantics. It reflects a real shift in understanding. For instance, the main diagnostic guide, DSM-5, it doesn't really list autism or Asperger's or pervasive developmental disorder separately anymore. These are now all under one umbrella term, autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. And the key things with ASD usually involve challenges with social communication, that sort of back and forth interaction. Plus, often, restricted interest, really deep focus on specific things and repetitive behaviors. The source material had this really striking example, someone getting kicked out of dozens of self-help groups, just because it's their communication style. Imagine that, seeking help and being excluded for the very thing you struggle with. Then we've got ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Key traits: inattention, hyperactivity, impulsivity. But that hyperactivity, it's not always bouncing off the walls, right? It can be internal.
Exactly, like an internal hyperactivity, a mind that's constantly racing, maybe jumping between thoughts.
Yeah, and that can lead to common struggles, things like real difficulty organizing stuff, being forgetful, or sometimes acting impulsively, like with spending. And then there's specific learning disorder, SLD. This is about really significant difficulties in specific skills, reading, writing, maybe math calculations.
Yeah, the examples from the community were very concrete, like someone who gets basic math okay, but just cannot solve word problems.
Or struggling massively with writing complex characters like kanji in Japanese. It shows learning isn't uniform at all.
Right. And it's important to remember this neurodevelopmental disorders group is quite broad. It also includes things like intellectual disability, communication disorders, developmental coordination disorders, sometimes called dyspraxia, and tic disorders too.
Okay, so the names are changing, the categories are shifting.
Yeah, and what's truly fascinating here is the why. There's this ongoing, quite lively debate about it all. Like, should medicine focus on diagnosing a disability, or should we be thinking more in terms of inherent conditions or just different ways the brain is wired?
Okay, so like, is it a deficit or just a difference?
Kind of. And different diagnostic systems might lean one way or the other. You know, the criteria used maybe for public health or benefits access might focus more on functional impairment.
Right.
Whereas clinical practice might focus more on the pattern of symptoms and behaviors. It adds layers of complexity to how these differences get understood and well labeled.
That actually leads perfectly into these two big ways of thinking about disability. The medical model versus the social model. The medical model basically identifies a characteristic, calls it a disorder, and then the focus is on trying to control or fix that characteristic in the person. Sometimes the medication is part of that, though the sources stress that doctors are usually pretty cautious, especially with kids. The goal is sort of changing the individual to fit in. Whereas the social model flips that. The classic example is the wheelchair user in the stairs. Instead of saying the person can't climb stairs, the social model says society creates the barrier by having stairs in the first place. So the solution isn't to fix the person, it's to build a ramp, change the environment, adapt society.
Exactly. It puts the onus on society to be more inclusive.
Right.
And this really raises important questions when it comes to actually getting a diagnosis in the real world, because it's complex. You see huge variation. Some doctors diagnose quite quickly, others are much more hesitant.
Which might lead to doctor shopping, right? People seeking second or third opinions.
It can, yeah. And that's sometimes seen negatively. But from another angle, if you need a formal diagnosis to access support services, especially since a lot of welfare is application-based,
So to ask for it, yeah.
then seeking a diagnosis strategically makes sense. It's about getting the help you need. But there's another side to it. A formal diagnosis can have downsides in, well, what the community calls neurotypical society.
Like stigma or issues with jobs.
Potentially, yes. So deciding whether to pursue a diagnosis isn't always straightforward. It's not just about the label itself. The key thing that came through is how vital it is for individuals to articulate their distress, their specific daily challenges. There was an example of someone initially seen as being in a developmental gray zone, sort of borderline.
Okay.
But later, when they clearly explained their daily struggles and had a clear purpose for the diagnosis, like needing access to a specific help or service, they received a more definitive diagnosis. It's about communicating the impact.
That makes sense. And gender plays a role too, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Girls, for example, might be better at masking symptoms, or their traits might be misinterpreted as just being a little clumsy or shy.
So they might get missed or diagnosed later than boys?
Often, yeah. And another huge point.
Yeah.
We don't yet have objective biological markers for these conditions. No blood test, no definitive brain scan.
Really? So how is it diagnosed then?
It often relies heavily on detailed history, observations, and self-report questionnaires. Things like the AQ test for ASD traits or the ADHD-RS for ADHD symptoms. Basically, structured ways of asking about experiences and behaviors.
So it's more about patterns over time, especially from childhood.
Exactly. Looking at early development is key. Symptoms that only appear much later might suggest something else is going on, maybe a secondary issue, rather than the primary neurodevelopmental condition itself.
Okay, this is really helpful context. Now, you mentioned cognitive profiles. Let's talk about those intelligence tests, WAIS and WISC.
Right, the Wechsler scales. WAIS for adults, WISC for kids.
And they look at 4 main areas, yeah. Verbal stuff, visual spatial reasoning, working memory, and processing speed.
That's right. But here's the crucial bit, and the community really emphasized this. It's often not about the overall IQ score.
Oh.
What's really informative is the pattern across those 4 areas, the ups and downs, the unevenness, sometimes called spiky profiles.
So someone might be really strong verbally, but struggle significantly with processing speed, for example.
Precisely. That variability, that spikiness, often tells you much more about a person's specific cognitive strengths and challenges than a single overall number does.
And I guess those absolute scores can be misleading anyway.
Definitely. Think about it, how you're feeling on the test day, if you're tired, anxious, if the room is too noisy or the lights are buzzing.
Sensory overload, yeah.
All of that can massively impact performance. So a score on one particular day might not reflect your actual underlying ability. It's a snapshot, not the whole picture.
Got it. Okay, so navigating these differences, these profiles, it sounds like it takes a lot of effort day to day.
It really can. And that constant effort, that chronic stress of trying to fit into a world that often doesn't naturally accommodate your way of thinking or processing, that can lead to other problems.
You mean like secondary disorders? That's what the sources call them.
Exactly. The community highlighted that, unfortunately, individuals with neurodevelopmental conditions are statistically more prone to developing other mental health conditions.
Like depression. Bipolar.
Yes, those and sometimes others like anxiety disorders or even schizophrenia. The leading theory is that the chronic stress is a major contributing factor.
Wow. And the sources mentioned something about lifespan, too.
Yeah, it's a difficult statistic, but research does suggest, on average, a shorter lifespan for individuals with ADHD and ASD compared to the general population, often linked to both physical health comorbidities and the impact of secondary mental health issues, including suicide risk.
That's sobering, which makes the whole idea of acceptance really important, I imagine.
Hugely important, and the community talks about disability acceptance as being multi-layered.
Multi-layered how?
Well, there's self-acceptance, which is a journey in itself.
Yeah.
Then there's acceptance from family, which can be variable, and acceptance from the wider environment, school, work, society.
And deciding whether to come out or disclose your diagnosis?
Yeah.
That must be complex, too.
Incredibly complex. It's a very personal decision with potential benefits, like getting accommodations, but also potential risks, like facing prejudice. There's no single right answer.
Let's shift gears slightly to something you mentioned earlier, sensory issues. Sensory hypersensitivity and hyposensitivity. This seems really common, but maybe not always well understood.
Definitely. It means having extreme sensitivity, or the opposite, unusual dullness, in one or more of the senses. Sight, sound, touch, taste, smell.
And the examples shared were so vivid, like extreme light sensitivity needing special glasses.
Yeah, or being able to hear incredibly faint sounds, like a tiny caterpillar chewing a leaf.
Wow. Or feeling rain hitting your skin like needles. That sounds intense.
It can be incredibly overwhelming. And then on the flip side, hyposensitivity, maybe not feeling pain normally. The source mentioned someone not realizing they'd broken a bone because the pain wasn't registering strongly.
Gosh, and there was that hypothesis about silent babies.
Ah, yes. The idea that some infants with intense sensory sensitivities might actually cry less because the act of crying itself, or the usual responses like being picked up or rocked, might be more overstimulating and unpleasant for them. It's a hypothesis, but an interesting one.
And then there's synesthesia. This is fascinating, when senses get linked up.
Exactly. One sense triggers an experience in another, like hearing a sound and seeing a color.
The source mentions someone experiencing voices as having specific colors, like a red to blue gradient.
Or words or numbers automatically having colors, which could sometimes actually cause confusion.
I read people can even experience tastes associated with people or places.
Yes, someone shared tasting mint when they thought of the beach, or associating people with specific tastes, like ginger. It's a really unique way of experiencing the world.
Is there any scientific idea about why this happens, or even why neurodevelopmental differences occur?
Well, one interesting hypothesis mentioned is the pruning hypothesis.
Pruning, like in gardening.
Kind of. The idea is that early in development, the brain forms a massive, almost explosive number of connections, synapses. Then there's a process of pruning away the connections that aren't needed or used efficiently.
Okay.
The hypothesis suggests that if this pruning process is insufficient or different, leaving maybe too many or less organized connections, it might contribute to neurodevelopmental conditions and potentially also to things like synesthesia and sensory sensitivities. It's still being researched, but it's a compelling idea about brain development.
So given all these unique experiences and challenges, how do people cope day to day? The sources talk about life hacks.
Yes, developing highly personalized strategies, almost like original combat styles for navigating daily life.
What kinds of things? Like for social interactions?
For interpersonal stuff, yeah. Things like consciously observing how others interact to learn techniques, or using structured approaches like philosophical dialogue, strict turn-taking, and conversation.
To avoid interrupting or being interrupted?
Exactly. Also, learning specific techniques for managing anger, being assertive, and even explicitly showing you're listening, because the usual cues might not come naturally.
And that communication gap you mentioned. ASD focusing on content, neurotypicals on reaction.
Right. Understanding that gap is key, and why some prefer written communication. It feels more precise, less ambiguous than spoken conversation with all its nuances.
Makes sense. What about practical things like forgetfulness?
Lots of strategies there, having spares of crucial items, keys, glasses, using poka-yoke or mistake-proofing systems, lists obviously, designated spots for everything, maybe even with labels or photos, everything boxes for random stuff that needs sorting later.
The doom box. I know that one.
Could be. And for time management, lateness, missed appointments, whiteboards, reminder apps are crucial. And building in big-time buffers, not just 5 minutes.
Good tip. Disorganization. Paperwork.
Categorizing ruthlessly critical versus non-critical, using a hold box for things you're unsure about, and scheduling time to review it regularly, not letting it pile up indefinitely.
Household chores. That can be overwhelming.
Definitely. Using prepared foods, frozen meals can be a lifesaver. And considering external help housekeepers, or maybe accessing welfare support helpers if eligible, taking the pressure off.
And managing the sensory stuff we talked about.
Practical things. Choosing clothes for comfort above all else, no scratchy labels. Using those colored glasses for light sensitivity. Earplugs, ear defenders, noise-canceling headphones for sound sensitivity. These aren't luxuries, they're essential tools for functioning.
Okay, so people develop these amazing strategies. But what about external support? You mentioned welfare systems are application-based.
Yes, this was a really strong message from the community. You generally have to ask. These supports don't just automatically appear.
So what kind of things are available?
It varies by location, obviously, but common things include systems to reduce the cost of medical care, like maybe only paying 10% of the cost, disability certificates or cards which can unlock various services or accommodations, rehabilitation certificates, and disability pensions.
You mentioned something specific about pensions.
Yeah, for certain types, like the Type 3 pension in Japan, there can be strict rules about things like which insurance scheme you were enrolled in on the date of your very first medical visit for the condition. It highlights how important it is to understand the local administrative details early on.
Wow, okay. Good to know. What else?
There is the help mark in Japan, a visible sign people can wear or display to indicate they might need assistance. Social skills training or SST programs, support for independent living.
And places to go for help navigating all this.
There are often government-run neurodevelopmental disorder support centers. Also, community-based consultation support offices, which might offer quicker responses sometimes.
And the idea of reasonable accommodation.
crucially important.
Yeah.
The community framed it not as charity or some absolute right you demand, but as a practical method for coexistence, meaning finding workable adjustments that allow everyone to function. Like asking for partitions in an open office to reduce distraction, or being allowed to wear colored glasses on your commute if fluorescent lights are overwhelming. It's collaborative problem solving.
That framing feels much more constructive.
It is. And speaking of support, the idea of third places came up as being incredibly important.
Third places, what's that?
Places that aren't home, first place, or work school, second place. Somewhere else you can go to de-stress, connect, just be without pressure.
Like community centers or cafes.
Could be. But often, self-help groups function as vital third places. They offer peer support connection with others who get it.
And the principle there is say it, hear it.
Often, yes. The idea is you can speak about your experiences without interruption or judgment, and you listen to others in the same way. It's incredibly validating. And these groups come in all shapes and sizes now, online forums, groups focused around specific hobbies, large organizations, lots of options.
Makes sense. What about work, employment?
The sources mention options like closed employment, basically, not disclosing your diagnosis versus open employment, where you do disclose, often requiring that disability certificate to access specific supports.
Like job coaches.
Exactly. Public employment services might have specialized counselors. There are job coaches who can help on site, and things like navigation books or employment passports tools to help you communicate your needs and strengths to an employer effectively.
Okay. We've covered so much. There were a couple other quite difficult topics mentioned too, weren't there?
Yes. The sources touched on Cassandra syndrome.
Right. That's the term used sometimes for the distress experienced by partners, often neurotypical partners, of individuals with ASD, usually stemming from misunderstandings and difficulties with communication and emotional connection. It highlights the impact on relationships.
It does. And also the very serious and sensitive issue of suicidal ideation among neurodivergent individuals. As we discussed, it's often linked to that chronic stress, feeling misunderstood, and the exhaustion of navigating a world not built for them. It's something that needs careful, compassionate attention.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Okay, we really have gone deep today, from just the basic definitions changing to the medical versus social models, the nuances of diagnosis.
And the lived reality sensory experiences, the incredible life hacks people come up with.
Yeah. And then the support systems, the importance of community, third places. It really hammers home that understanding neurodiversity isn't static. We constantly need to update our knowledge and shift our perspectives.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you can see how all these different viewpoints, the medical understanding, the social model, the lived experience, they all contribute something vital. Recognizing that neurodevelopmental differences are on a spectrum, and that these varied ways of thinking and experiencing the world actually add to the richness of, well, humanity. That feels like the key takeaway. It's diversity, not just deficit.
So maybe a final thought for everyone listening. When we see just how incredibly varied individual experiences are, especially sensory and cognitive ones, what does normal even really mean? And maybe more importantly, how can you in your own life contribute to building a society that genuinely embraces that whole wide spectrum? We'll close with a really powerful quote that came from the Community Insights, a message of resilience. We live or die every day. Therefore, use all resources to somehow survive and reach the lighthouse. Let's do this.